Now we're going to discuss translation theories. So, if God has communicated to us through the vehicle of human messengers, and it's been transmitted over time and over languages, this means that there needs to be translation involved. And there are two basic choices that translators have to make when translating these divinely revealed messages from messengers in a particular time and culture and language, like Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. They have a textual question and a linguistic question. The textual question has to do with the actual wording of the original text that was written down, and the linguistic question has to do with one's theory of translation. So the textual question: since we don't have any handwritten originals for any biblical book, but instead what we have are thousands upon thousands of copies that were produced by hand, which are called manuscripts. These manuscripts are copied over a period of about 1,400 years for the New Testament, before the Gutenberg printing press, which increased the ability to have uniformity across large swaths of copies. Instead, and it took even longer than that for the Old Testament, but instead, before the printing press invention, all copies were written by hand. So therefore, no two manuscripts are exactly the same. So they've all been copied by hand, so there are errors, human errors. When I use the word error, I mean that there are copyist errors. Letters get changed, words get reordered, lines get skipped, things of that nature. Most of these copying errors are very easily reconciled and present no real theological difficulty. Although there are a few of those, they're very, very minute. And to think about the breadth of body of work, that there are literally thousands and thousands and thousands of these ancient manuscripts that have been copied over thousands of years, to think that they're as close as they are is actually quite mind-boggling. But for the textual question for translators, since no two manuscripts are exactly the same, their job is to compare all of the varying manuscripts and try to determine which variants represent errors and which ones represent the original text. And one of the ways that they do this is something called textual criticism. It's a scientific method in which translators try to figure out which texts are the originals or closest to the originals. And this science has careful controls, though it's not an exact science because it's dealing with lots and lots of human variables. And so there are two kinds of evidence that translators consider when making textual choices. Like when your Bible has a footnote, says some manuscripts do not have. This is the translators letting you know that there are variations between manuscripts, and they want you to know what those variations are. And as a side note, it's very helpful for you and I to read the footnotes in our Bible. The translators have put them there for a reason, so that we can have a broader experience and understanding of what these ancient documents actually say. So there's two types of evidence. There's external evidence and there's an internal evidence. External evidence has to do with the quality and age of the manuscripts that support a given variant. How old is the document? What shape is it in? Etc. And then there's internal evidence, which has to do with the copyists and the authors. Usually the variant that best explains how all the others came to be is the one that we presume is the original text. And we can all do this in our native language pretty intuitively. If you have 4 English sentences and they're all varied a little bit differently, you can pretty easily figure out which one is the original or which one is correct, because you have the ability to deduce, well, that word was misspelled in this one and this word was put in the wrong place on that one, but this is the way it should read in English. And you can see that all of these other variants were transmitted from this original one. So that's sort of the process that translators use for these ancient documents. Then there's the linguistic question, which perhaps is probably most interesting to most of us, because this part of translation, which has to do with the verbal and the grammatical, is about the transferring of words and ideas from one language to another. And for those of you who are bilingual or trilingual or speak multiple languages, you do this as well. When you're trying to figure out how to take words and grammar from one language and transmit them in a way that makes sense to another language that might not have the exact same words and idioms and grammar, etc. So in this process, right, in the linguistic question for translators, there's a few things here that I want to acquaint you with. The original language, the language that was the origin that you're trying to translate from, for our cases in the Bible would be Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. The original language is the one that is being translated from into what's called the receptor language, which is the language that you're trying to get it across to. For many of us, it would be English or perhaps Spanish or Japanese or whatever it is, into some modern language. Between those two things, the original language and the receptor language, there's something called a historical distance. This historical distance is the gap between those two realities. This distance exists because there are different words, different grammar, different idioms, as well as culture and history. Modern 21st century American culture and language and idiom is very different than ancient Greek and certainly ancient Mesopotamian and far Near Eastern culture. So the theory of translation, what translators are doing, is basically trying to figure out how far do we go to try to narrow that gap of historical distance. What choices do we make to try to bridge for people to understand in their language what these guys were talking about in theirs? So there's a couple of different things here that are some technical terms, but they're formal equivalence and functional equivalence, which basically just means there's kind of a word for word. This would be formal equivalence, where the translator is attempting to stay as close to the original language in both words and grammar as can be understandable in the receptor language, let's say English. And then there's functional equivalence, which is sometimes called thought for thought or dynamic translation. And this is where the translators are attempting to keep the meaning of the original language by putting their words and idioms into a normal way of speaking in English. So they're not as strictly trying to translate word for word, but they're trying to take the concept and communicate the idea a little bit more closely into a way that would be more natural for the receptor language for English. And then there's something called free translation, which is simply someone maybe doing a thought for thought, sometimes called a paraphrase, where they're trying to translate ideas from one language to another without really trying to preserve the exact words or the original. And so we get to this question of, well then, which translation should I read? If the translators are taking different approaches and making different choices in how to bridge that historical distance, how to bridge that historical gap of what was actually written into what I can understand if I don't have access to the original languages, meaning I don't speak or write or understand ancient Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic, which many of us don't, then we're relying on those who do to translate it to us in a way that we will understand. And so which translation should we read? Well, I would start by saying it's very important to read the preface of your Bible. Most Bibles are going to have a preface. I have the NIV here in my hand, and there's a 3-page preface that says Translation Philosophy. It has textual basis, footnotes, and formatting. Basically, the committee who put this translation together, the committee of translators, are telling me, the reader, how they put it together and the choices that they made and their philosophy of why they translated this particular version the way that they did. That's very helpful information for me as a reader to understand. As I'm reading their translation, they're helping me to know why they translated certain things a certain way. This is very helpful and useful information for me. So which translation should you read? Well, for serious Bible study, I would highly encourage and recommend you to stay within that functional equivalence, that sort of dynamic range on that spectrum. So things like the NIV or the Holman Christian Standard. Obviously, not all of the English versions are represented on this spectrum, but it's just given to give you an idea of where things sort of fall. The huge advantage that we have as English speakers, if you are an English speaker, is that we have more versions in our language than any other language in the world by far. So we have lots of options. This can, on one hand, seem a little overwhelming, but on another hand, it can actually be quite rewarding because it offers us a greater scope to be able to have, without knowing the ancient languages, to have a better opportunity to know what those ancient documents are really communicating. So my recommendation would be, if you've been reading the Bible for a while, you've read it all the way through at least once or maybe twice, I would encourage you to start reading the Bible in other English versions that you're not used to. Let's say that you're used to reading the NIV. Maybe try a different version that maybe falls somewhere else on the spectrum. For serious study, try to stay in the middle of the spectrum, in that functional equivalence or that dynamic range, but also augment your reading with the various poles, whether that be paraphrases or free translations, or the formal equivalents, things like the King James or the New American Standard, because these help to give us greater insight and can be very edifying for us, especially if we're used to a particular translation. I believe that every Christian should have a good study Bible. A good study Bible is a great way for us to be aided and to be equipped to access the Bible by those who have had more experience and research and study than us. Not all study Bibles, I would say, are good, but many of them are. And again, in the English language, we have a plethora of options. I would recommend, as a starting point, if you don't have a good study Bible, what's called the NIV Biblical Theology Study Bible. This was recently released this year, I believe in 2018, 2019, when this recording is happening. It used to be titled the NIV Study Bible before that. Now it's been retitled the NIV Biblical Theology Study Bible. This is a great introductory study Bible that I think would be helpful for most all Christians. My second recommendation would be what's called the NIV Cultural Backgrounds Study Bible. This is a study Bible that really focuses on helping to bridge that historical distance by helping modern English readers know a little bit more about the historical backgrounds of when these writings were being written, which for us many times is the greatest distance that we have, because ancient Near Eastern life was very different than what we have today, and how we understand the world and our worldviews can be very different at times. This creates distance as we modern readers read the text, and it can introduce a lot of opportunity for us to misunderstand and therefore misapply and misinterpret what was actually being said. So these types of study Bibles and these types of resources can be very, very helpful for us.